Okay, so picture this. A secret love affair that goes on for years. It all comes to a head in a violent, revenge-fueled standoff. Two men start shooting, and in the middle of all that chaos, a woman is killed. Let's dive into this really tragic story and try to unravel who was truly responsible for her death.
And those are the words of the homeowner, Daniel Gian. He found himself in a deadly shootout, right on his own front porch. From where he's standing, he was just defending his home and his family from a guy who showed up with a gun. Simple as that.
So at the heart of this whole tragedy, you have two men. On one side, there's Matthew Mullikone. He's this wealthy business owner who just found out his wife's affair wasn't over like he thought. And on the other side, Daniel Gian, the man she was seeing. Their worlds were on a collision course, and, well, it was going to end in absolute disaster.
And that right there is the million-dollar question for this entire investigation. Kimberly Mullikone, who was Matthew's wife, she got caught right in the crossfire. But with bullets flying from two different guns, figuring out who was legally responsible, that became a really complex and honestly a morally messy puzzle to solve.
So let's start where the cops did, right in the middle of total, absolute chaos. When officers got the call to a quiet suburban street, they had no idea the hornet's nest they were about to walk into.
That's the call you hear coming over the radio from the first responders. It immediately tells you the stakes here are life and death. In the backseat of a Jeep, Kimberly Mullikone was bleeding out. The situation was critical.
For the 31 officers who responded, the scene was just a complete nightmare. You've got a smoking car, a frantic Matthew Mullikone screaming for help, but he's also pointing at a house claiming a shooter's barricaded inside. Information is just flying at them from every direction, making it an incredibly dangerous and confusing situation to walk into.
Okay, so as the dust starts to settle and the scene gets secured, investigators are left with two key people and two completely different stories about what just happened. And untangling these two versions of events, that was going to be the core of the whole case. What's just wild about this is how completely opposite these stories are. Matthew says he just went there to talk, and boom, he was ambushed by Daniel, who came out like Rambo. But Daniel tells police that Matthew showed up like a crazed lunatic, waving a gun around, which forced him to fire a warning shot to protect his home. I mean, somebody's obviously lying here. So to figure out who to believe, detectives had to start digging into the lives of both of these families. They got a search warrant for the Mullikone's mansion, and what they found there started to paint a very, very different picture of this supposedly aggrieved husband.
Inside this massive, almost 8,000 square foot house, police find clear evidence of a violent fight down in the basement. Things are shattered everywhere. They also find lines of cocaine on a table and multiple gun safes. All this evidence started to suggest that this was a really volatile home environment, probably fueled by a lot of substance abuse.
And this timeline just lays it all out perfectly. Matthew knew about the affair years ago, but thought it was over. But then, just 45 days before the shooting, he finds out it never stopped. The final straw? The very day of the shooting, he discovers Kimberly wired $60,000 of their company's money to Daniel. That discovery leads to a huge, violent, drug-fueled fight. And just a few hours later, Matthew, now armed with two guns, drives his wife straight into the confrontation he was looking for.
The other side of the story confirmed the motive. Daniel's own sister, Gabriella, called the affair with Kimberly tumultuous. She knew it was the reason for all the conflict. In fact, she told police she'd blocked Kimberly's number because she just didn't want to deal with the drama anymore.
So at this point, investigators have a clear motive. They have two stories that totally contradict each other. But they still need that one thing, something definitive that could just cut through all the lies. They needed a witness that couldn't be biased, couldn't be scared, and couldn't possibly forget what happened.
And this created a classic stalemate, right? You've got two guys, and each one is painting himself as the victim who was just forced to shoot to protect himself. Honestly, it would have been impossible to solve this with just their testimony alone. But then, while they were interviewing Daniel, detectives found out about a silent observer, one that had captured the entire violent mess from beginning to end.
And that witness? It was Daniel Gian's home surveillance system. He had multiple CCTV cameras pointed right at the driveway where the whole shootout went down. The objective truth was just a few clicks away.
So what did the video actually show? Well, first off, it completely dismantled Matthew's story. You see his Jeep pull up, you see him get out, and you see him immediately and aggressively confront Daniel. Now, Daniel does fire a warning shot, but it's Matthew who pulls his gun next and opens fire, starting the real shootout.
And here's the most critical piece of it all. While both men are firing back and forth, the single, tragic bullet that hits and kills Kimberly, it comes from Daniel's gun.
This just created a huge legal headache for the prosecutors. The guy who started the whole fight wasn't the one who fired the fatal shot. So how in the world do you assign blame in a situation that is this messy?
I mean, this was the exact question the prosecution had to answer for the jury. On the surface, it seems pretty simple. Daniel fired the shot, so he should be responsible. But the law, especially when you're talking about self-defense, is way more nuanced than that.
Matthew ended up being charged with voluntary manslaughter. The key phrase here is heat of passion and the circumstances surrounding it. The prosecution basically argued that Matthew's actions created a situation where a deadly outcome wasn't just possible, it was pretty much inevitable.
So here's how the prosecution connected the dots. It's what's called the but-for cause. Even though he didn't pull the trigger that killed his wife, but for him driving there armed and intoxicated, but for him escalating a fight into a shootout, Kimberly would still be alive. He created that deadly crossfire, so the law says he's legally responsible for the death that happened because of it.
And you know what? The jury agreed. Matthew Mullikone was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter and also attempted murder for shooting at Daniel. He was sentenced to a maximum of 40 years in prison.
And Daniel Guillen? He was cleared of everything. Under Michigan law, it was determined he was legally defending his home and his family from an armed aggressor who came onto his property looking for a fight. In the end, Matthew Mullikone's own words from a jailhouse phone call might just be the most chilling part of this whole thing. Despite that undeniable video evidence, he was still convinced of his own version of the truth, a belief that ultimately destroyed two families and led to the tragic and completely needless death of his own wife.